All right, if that's okay. Terrific. So, well, welcome everybody. We've just had a nice chat, but I'm going to just share a couple of very quick slides that are going to help us just start this webinar. So, you know that our topic is going to be finance and transition. In a moment, I'm going to give the floor to Bert, who's going to talk a little bit more about our topic. But just in terms of the schedule that we're going to be using for the next couple of hours, you've got this very brief welcome and procedures right now from me. Framing is going to be Bert. We then have our two speakers coming on, Dirk and Dirk, and you'll hear more about their background from Bert. Then we'll have a few words from Bert afterwards. So he's going to help contextualize not only at the beginning, but also as we move into the interactive part. Before we get into a Q&A, we're going to have some buzz groups. So I'll put you in small groups as we have done in our past webinars. So you get a chance just to talk with a couple of other people about your reflections, observations, your opinions about what we're talking about. So for 15 minutes. Then we'll come back here into the plenary and we'll open the floor for discussion. So that will be moderated by Bert, by myself and Jan, who's going to be taking some notes as we go along. So as he has done for past webinars, he takes a few notes, but he also collects some questions. So if questions occur to you as our speakers are speaking, then please feel free to write them in the chat. We'll collect those and we'll make sure that they come back in the plenary. We'll probably ask you to do them, but we won't forget what they are. So feel free to note into the chat any questions or comments that arise. And then we'll close with some reflections just from Bert at the end of our 2-hour session. So we're going to ask you to mute yourself when you're not speaking, just because of ambient noise. If you're happy to use video, please do so. But a couple of people have already said they're in low bandwidth areas, and so that's not a problem. Maybe if you ask a question, if you can, you might want to turn your video on. We'll use the hand raise function just because if we get up to 20 people, it'll just help our speakers see where everybody is and who wants to talk, and just help us with the time. So you probably already know how this works. I think, you know, we're a group of people who've done this a couple times before, I'm sure. Here is just what's going on in terms of the different functionality you've got, where your mute is, the hand raise, which is at the bottom of the participant list, and then the chat. And I just wanted to, something new in Zoom, relatively new, is the spotlight function. So I'm going to be using the spotlight function for our speakers, and that works well if you're in the speaker view. So I think in gallery view it also works, but the speaker view, and those of you who, it's up in the upper right-hand corner, you click on view, and you can change it between gallery view when you see everybody together, or to speaker view. So if you click on speaker view, then you get a little bit better experience when it comes to participation. So I'm going to stop sharing now. I was going to run a bit of a little introduction exercise, but since we're not our full complement, I might do that when we get to the breakout. So at this point, hi Christina, you've come in. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to you, Bert, to frame our discussion.
Okay, so I share my screen. I hope you all see my screen now.
Yes.
Thank you, Gillian, for the best introduction on Zoom I have had so far. Very helpful. And my introduction will be quite brief. This was already what was sent to me as the agenda. So I'll go to the next slide, at least I hope. That's what I will do. And I want to tell you that we have, of course, discussed, or at least touched upon, the role of money and broader the financing and the global financial system. I remember discussions with Hartmut Bossel and Niels Meyer, who were really sounding the alarm in the 90s when we saw these massive amounts of money flowing around in the world. In 2001, Herman Daly gave us an updated version of his talk at the World Bank, about the financial system. I remember Ferenc Robber, who joined his experiences with us as Minister of Finance. We had Ted Heinz telling us about the gaming element and the speculation in the financial system. We had Bernard Lietaer, who told us about alternative currencies and also awoke us to the idea, which was, at least to me, completely novel at the time: who creates money? 96% of the money is created by banks. Incredible. And I also remember Dirk Urbach telling us about transitions in 2013. And I just recalled here that he introduced himself as post-normal. Dirk himself gave already comment on this, but we can come back to this. So my own interest in the financial system is relatively new, I have to say, because I have followed the standard economic thinking for a long time, which means that money is irrelevant. The whole economy is money neutral. If you double the amount of money, you will have double the economic activity. That's it. And slowly I discovered, of course, ignited by the financial crisis in 2008, that things simply work differently. So at the moment, my interest is channeled a little bit because I'm a member of the Sustainable Finance Lab since 2011, if I recall well. And that's how I met also Dirk Schoenmaker and learned about his work. And also a couple of other colleagues, including Klaas van Egmond, with whom we made a model, simulation model in VentSim, in order to find out if we really understand how this system works. And I have to admit right away that first, even after making the model, I still don't really understand how the system works. And secondly, we discovered that the practice of making a system dynamics model to understand what's going on is fairly alien among economists, including among the professors of economics in the Sustainable Finance Lab. So it was an interesting exercise, which we published last year. And I hope we can continue with this kind of effort and interest. But my interest, as I said, in terms of content, is that the SDGs also, of course, on the one hand, all are very dependent on the possibility to generate enough finance for these lofty goals. And on the other hand, the SDGs themselves, if you read carefully the various points, hardly talk about the financial system or the international financial system. At the same time, we also know increasingly that the present financial system is one of the causes of increasing inequality in income and wealth, which has been another issue in the Balaton Group for the last 30 years. So also from that perspective, it is very important to say something or explore the relationship between the various sustainable development goals on the one hand and the international financial system. And I'll send this presentation to Gillian so it can be sent out if you're interested. I'll go very fast here. But one of our colleagues in Sustainable Finance Lab, Dirk Bezemer, pointed out that what's happening now is what he calls the debt shift, which means that over the last 20, 30 years, since deregulation, banks have discovered that you can really make money by indebting more and more people, including households. And you can do this because you create the money yourself. And another interesting report by Oxfam and also some other groups like Positive Money tries to identify how this bank credit expansion has actually increased the inequality in wealth and in income. And they outline three important loops, which I personally think I have all seen when reading journals and watching television over the past decades. There is a third element which was interesting to me also, and most explicitly framed by Zuckman in his book on hidden wealth, where he points out that the role of governments is not eroded only by the, let's say, neoliberal ideology, but also by the very fact of tax evasion at a massive scale. In fact, the Netherlands is one of the villains in the sense that we have thousands of small companies with sometimes one person employed here in Amsterdam who is just helping to channel all those money streams to tax havens. So there are several elements, several reasons for me to think that a meeting of the Balaton Group on this topic, the international financial system, in relation to the various development goals, sustainable development goals, is important. So I was very happy to learn then that our, let me say, member, Dirk Lobach, and my colleague from the Sustainable Finance Lab, Dirk Schoenmaker, were about to publish this report, Finance in Transition. And I think this is, for us, an opportunity. We know Dirk from his work on transitions. Dirk is professor of economics at Rotterdam University, Erasmus University, and has also a lot of experience in finding out what the banks and the whole financial system is about and how it actually derailed, more or less. So I'm happy that the two of you are willing to present this recent report and give us the opportunity to listen to you and have a discussion later on. So this is what I would like to say as introduction.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bert and Gillian, for hosting us and for having us, and thank you for this great introduction. Very happy to be back. I have very good memories of actually 2013. I thought it was not so long ago. I remember I had to leave early for all sorts of reasons, and I also remember the reasons, which was very uncomfortable and not so nice. At the same time, I have very fond memories about the conversations we had then and the inspiration I drew from it. And to this day, following sort of the conversations that are ongoing, and I think it's more urgent than ever. I was also looking back at what I presented there. I think you will get a bit of an evolved version today. At the same time, I will try to bring the same kind of optimism that I still have from this transition perspective. And we start with the problems, of course, but then hopefully we end up in an optimistic note. What we're going to do the next 30-35 minutes is together with my colleague Dirk and Dirk, that's, yeah, those are very Dutch names, present the journey we took maybe the last 6 months in writing this report. It's actually also the outcome of a very sort of in-depth conversation that we had together with a third author, Willem Schramade, who is also has a PhD, but he has an investment background. And the three of us, we had a discussion on the transition perspective and the finance system. Just like Bert described, we all see the problems and what are the challenges. So I will talk a bit on transitions, but I first want to ask Dirk to introduce himself, because I'm no finance expert. Dirk is. So maybe, Dirk, can you introduce yourself and maybe also say a bit on how you got to invite me to start the process that led to this publication?
Yeah, thank you, Dirk. Because when we started this conversation, Willem and I asked Dirk to join us in a paper on financing transitions. And then you all know Dirk even better than I know him. he lured us into changing the equation by putting the financial system itself in transition. And that's the outcome you see before you. And that was really interesting because it are really the underlying paradigms which are the reason why sometimes the financial system, like other parts of the system, are not helpful to transition, rather than that financing itself. The money is there, but it is how you deal with the money. That's the issue. And if I give my personal transition, I'm a business economist, trained and lawyer, and worked at the Ministry of Finance, worked in education, central bank. And basically, if you get a training, and you all know that, you're trained as Homo economicus, and you know what it means in the financial sector. So when you draft your labor contract, you get paid for your contract, and then you expect to pay it the second time if you do what you say you are going to do. That is called a bonus. And that's a good characterization of the financial system. Without incentives, people wouldn't come out of bed. Everything is based on self-interest and neoliberal views, the Homo economicus. My own experience comes from nature. I was on a trial in Africa, close to Mozambique. I think it was Melito who was there, in Botswana. And then if you look at the extracts of an hyena, and maybe some of you know it, they're light gray, because that means they are eating the bone. So normal, if animals kill each other, they just eat the meat. And then the hyenas eat the remaining bones. And that's really, there you really get the circular nature, the circular working of nature. The only incoming thing is solar energy and water, and then it is a self-contained system. And we all know that in this group, that if we treat the earth like that, there wouldn't be any sustainability problem, and we wouldn't have a meeting today. So that was for me the eye-opener, that the circular system is quite natural, it is there, but only we have to want to apply it. Then I became a Homo sustenendus. My Latin is not that good. So
I don't know if it's correct, Dirk, this word, but
okay, then you have to give me the better word later on. And basically, I've been writing a textbook with Willemsgemade and other things. And for me, it starts with laying out the sustainability challenges. And then whatever you do, whether you're doing accounting, finance, or you're a central bank, or you are, whatever you do, you ask how that field can help in reaching the sustainability challenges, rather than the other way around. And that's the basic insight. And that's why all my course works with master students, executive education, always start with the sustainability challenges rather than with finance. And once you have passed the mindset, you can do a lot. And now we go to the real transition to Derek.
I think, yeah, I wanted to speed up on the sustainability challenges. What was interesting to me is that that our conversation started with the question, how do we get enough money to fund a transition? So how do we get the finance to finance a transition? And that's also a very popular debate in the Dutch politics, where we now have commitments to Paris climate agreements and to biodiversity goals. But it becomes a cost-benefit discussion. So it's all like it's a policy challenge, and we have to find money to fund it, and we have to do it in a way that it doesn't harm economic growth, basically. And maybe later on in the discussion we can talk about the recovery packages. But my response also to Dirk was that's the wrong question, because transition is inevitable, and I think this has been well known since the Club of Rome reports, basically, that we are on an economic pathway that is unsustainable. So these figures, to me, they symbolize this unsustainability. We do a lot, We talk a lot, we make sustainability policies, or we call it corporate social responsibility. We set targets, but the bigger picture is still more of the same. I don't have to repeat it, but that was the basis, the premise of the transitions research. And sort of the start also of my work on the transition governance. Because the premise that is hidden in here is that if something is unsustainable, sooner or later, it will lead to structural change. And that has been the case throughout history. So there's been all sorts of examples of these historical system changes, transitions, that happened for reasons of technological innovation, for reasons of political and societal unrest, for reasons of all sorts of disruption, for reasons of leadership, like political leadership. But there's also been a lot of examples of transitions that didn't happen because of all sorts of other dynamics, like the picture on the top. It's 1979. Some of you were very present then. I was 4 years old, but there was Jimmy Carter opening a solar farm in front of the White House, which was demolished 3 days later when Ronald Reagan came into the White House. And the first thing in office was to get rid of that rubbish and start decades of neoliberal growth with Margaret Thatcher. Let's not go there. This led, so this kind of question, okay, we've had these transitions in the past, we are stuck in this unsustainability. What is the explanation? And people from all sorts of different disciplines are now involved in this transition research, and the core understanding is that in a societal system, we collectively develop what we refer to as a regime. So it's a shared way of doing, thinking, and organizing. So in a society, what we do is we develop routines as individuals, we develop organizational structures, we develop discourse paradigms, we invest in technologies, we develop regulations and all sorts of institutions. And so a lot of, behind a lot of this is systems thinking. In a lot of different disciplines, you see the same kind of patterns. So we work a lot with resilience communities, draw a lot from systems thinking, but also from behavioral psychology or organizational theory, institutional theory. You see a same kind of pattern that over time we develop certain path dependencies. Some would say it's a lock-in. We've built the road, we've moved to a distant location, we've bought a car, so we're more or less stuck with it. And the same applies to a higher order level of societal systems. So it's not an evil thing. A regime is not a bad thing. It's also not controlled by someone. To a large extent, we're all part of it. So in transitions research, a regime is a very important starting point to start to ask, okay, what are our own path dependencies? Where are we stuck in? And how does it apply to a specific system? So this was basically the question I came to Dirk with. So let's not start with a solution. Let's start with asking, what is the problem? What is actually the finance regime? What was your answer, Dirk?
Yeah. And can I ask everybody to turn on the screen if that's possible, because then we have a bit more personal interaction. And thank you. That's really nice. First of all, you mentioned Ronald Reagan and Thatcher. If you have watched The Crown, the two ladies were battling, the Queen and Thatcher. But basically, with the start of liberalization, I was in the UK when for study when the Big Bang happened. The stock market was released, banking insiders, the first, second banking directive in the EU, and basically you see. Up till 1975, 1980, the financial system was stable. The banking assets to GDP was about 1. And since then, it has been starting to rise with a very minor decline in the aftermath of the crisis. And basically, if you then look at the bottom picture, the red one is the business cycle and the blue one, the financial cycle. The cyclicality in the financial system has become stronger than in the economy itself. And I'm from the Netherlands, and I think Denmark is quite close. All our money is in mortgages. The banks have less SME lending than mortgages nowadays. Means house prices are very high. If house price increase, people consume more because they feel wealthy. As soon as house prices decrease, even if it is only on paper, they feel poor and they stop consuming. So the economic cycle has become deeper in countries with a large financial system. So we had a deeper recession than Germany and Belgium in the last financial crisis. And so the financial system has more or less outgrown the economy and overtaken the economy. And if we go to the next slide, Dirk, then basically what is underlying it? Dirk was talking about culture, structure, and practice. And no surprise to you that the main thinking, rapport, shareholder value, shareholder primacy has taken root. All our finance books at university are about maximizing firm value, maximizing profit. There is no mainstream finance book which is not doing that. So I'm planning on a corporate finance book for a sustainable world, but that would really be the exception. So the whole system and the whole teaching has been evolved in shareholder primacy, market efficiency. If you know better, go out to the market and buy it, because if you know better than what the price is, and you know this circular thinking, and that has been evolved in, well, that's taken over the financial system, this financial value, shareholder value thinking. And it has become an end in itself. So the purpose of a pension fund is earning money, of course, enough to pay its pensioners, but earning enough financial return has become the main aim, and that's for all types of financial institutions. I will come at the end a bit to private versus public money. But I would say that that difference is less important. What's more important, what is driving the system? Is it money making, earning money, or is it I want to achieve something else? I think whether it's public or private is secondary. It is really what is the aim of the system.
Yeah, sorry for the small letters. You can. It's also a table from the report, but the core message here is that in the last 40, 50 years, maybe, instead of taking the environmental warning seriously, what happened was a liberalization and a globalization of a financial system that is completely based on producing more money. So extracting value to produce money. And what you do to maximize your money making is to reduce all sorts of costs. So to externalize all the negative factors that influence your money making system. So the interesting thing is, and Bert said it also in his introduction, this led to this whole amount of practices that are clearly undesirable. Tax evasion, it's all legal, but it's regulated, but it's undesirable. But it also leads to institutions like ours, the university, where we teach students thousands a year. We train them in this mindset. And this is happening all across the globe. And they all come into the companies and into public offices and into the financial system. And their normal way of thinking is to produce money. So now we come to transition, because the signs that this regime is not sustainable are overwhelming, of course. We'll get to how it links to all sorts of economic sectors, but the economic crisis is one of the indications, but also the societal unrest. all sorts of vulnerabilities that are becoming more evident, but also the system risk that actual climate or biodiversity collapse poses to the economy and the finance system. So the indicators of what we call destabilization are increasing. And I think it's very interesting to see that the last couple of months, this pandemic is only exaggerating or magnifying the underlying tensions. I said it before, we can talk about the blackness or the not so greenness of the recovery funds later. But what it does, it adds to destabilization and the doubts of professionals and citizens across the globe about long-term prospects and the uncertainty about the future, but also the need to change course somehow. And these are some pictures from my inaugural. So transitions are defined as a process of structural systemic change from one state to the other. I'll show the picture we use now, but basically from using resilience terminology, it's basically a phase shift from one dynamic equilibrium to the other. But that transition can be very disruptive or destructive even, as we saw also in history or some economic sectors that collapsed, or it can be relatively smooth. There was the original naive idea of transition management. If we know that something is unsustainable, why don't we just work together to change the system anyway? That's a bit of a naive idea maybe, but it's still conceptually true. So this is now how we sort of simplify the idea of what a transition is, but also create a template for a storyline about the transition that we want. Basically, understanding transitions as two interacting patterns. On the one hand, and that starts on the top left, we are all part of these regimes where we try to do our best to make things better. But that adds to this path dependency. So we improve the existing, but more and more it becomes difficult to change, and we feel increasing pressures for change, and things start to go wrong. So these destabilizations start to happen, and more people also start to feel that they lose control, or that it's not so clear anymore what the future is. So they start to experience chaos, and this might be leading to collapse. The other part of what's happening in societal systems, and which is also the reason for my optimism in general, is that very early on, people start to recognize this path dependency. So they listen to the warnings of scientists, or maybe they are entrepreneurs and just see better alternatives. So they start to experiment. They change their lifestyle, maybe they become vegetarian, or they start to experiment with solar panels or whatever, with alternative currencies, or they come up with new technologies, digital platforms to make your own economy. That over time can become cheaper, more attractive, less alternative. And then what a transition is really a process where new combinations are made. So often elements from an old regime, they make new connections with emerging alternatives and develop or grow or evolve into a new future regime. That's easier said than done, because these are evolutionary processes, so they take decades, and we're all in the middle of it, and there is no clear demarcation. So we might be, as a person, part of the regime in one area, of a niche in another area. As a professional, it might be different yet again. What we use it for in transitions research is to start asking the right questions. Where are we? What is happening? And where do we want to go? So this is also the question I asked Dirk. So how feasible is it that we might see a transition in the finance system? And what would be the alternative? So maybe just asking this question, Dirk. So I'm also now concerned about these recovery packages, but do you feel that the current finance regime is still very stable, or would you say it is destabilizing, and why?
It really is more of the same. So banks keep on lending to the old clients in the hope that they survive and then they get the full amount back. Governments invest in existing companies, so the default risk, the amount of defaults is even going down. Normally it would go up in a crisis because everybody gets money and everybody is afraid to change the status quo. So the average economy is now kept in place by government money. That's happening in the Netherlands. At the European level, at least, they've tried that a large chunk of the recovery package is for green. And they very smartly called it the Next Generation Fund. And at least they are trying. In our case, and that's really this structure issue. Our Ministry of Economic Affairs has become responsible for climate. So the Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate. And that order is the thinking of the minister. So at the moment, he's only thinking of the economic sectors and for example, we were starting with a carbon tax in the Netherlands, but now he's handing out extra permits, extra certificates, because he's so afraid for the industry. So for the next 10 years, the carbon tax will not work. So each time when there is a choice for economic recovery rather than for green recovery. And that basically means that the mindset of that minister is still in the old way. Then he hits Parliament, and that's what happened with the European Commission president. She had to choose a third party that has become the Greens. Now we have the Green Deal. And in the Netherlands, we have a minority in the first chamber, so they need the Greens to get the package through. So now our growth fund for the future has become also get the restriction that it has to be green. So there are small corrections, but the insiders are still in the old thinking. And that's really a pity because you can spend money only once. So you now do the average economy, and then in 5 years' time, we say, oh, sorry, we should have done the green one only.
That's, Helga points at the short time span of politicians. I think that's a very fair point that short time horizon, and Anupam asked about the business side. I think for both cases, their decision horizons are very short term. At the same time, this is also what we see in all these areas, and this is what we call a regime. So we are so focused on improving the existing that we are blind to the longer term risk that something better will emerge, and that this path will hit a dead end to some extent. And I think
interesting. Can I add a bit of politics? I really found it very brave for Biden to put out his green agenda before the election took place, and by having a separate commissioner who's the most powerful as person in the commission to give the green agenda without any other jobs. Politics can sometimes turn. We have to wait and see whether Europe is making it through and whether Biden will do it. But sometimes really having a dedicated party who's really going after this issue can really help.
Yeah, and I think also the longer term perspective of transition is that in the end, we will have collapse of this regime anyway. And there is sort of a reinforcing a dynamic that the worse it gets, the more people start to support alternatives. And in the end, it's for future historians to decide whether we are quick enough or we woke up quick enough. That's very difficult to say. but it's inevitably happening. And I think if you compare it to the economic crisis 10, 12 years ago, what's happening now, and the amount of push also from the UN, but also from within countries, the kind of efforts EU is doing, but also what's happening to some extent in China and now the US, I think there's more momentum, and this momentum is also supported by a lot of emerging sustainability transitions in very relevant markets. So part of the short-termism is also the blindness to exponential growth and the potential of what we would call transformative innovation. So it's not only the technological disruption. So think of the solar panels and the wind energy, also now electric vehicles and battery storage. But you can also point at the shifts in diets and the changes in how we produce food, what is now possible in terms of nature positive food systems. But what we also see is the whole divestment movement and the enormous shift that is happening in credit agencies and in banks and in regulators that are looking for natural capital assessments, or that are looking for different ways to measure impact and value created. So I'm now was involved the last couple of months in the UN in a policy brief, UNEP policy brief related to the GO6 report. We had a whole conversation with because they asked me and 4 other authors to make a 16-page summary of what GO6 means for the business community. And GO6, I hope you, I think most of you know, it's this massive ecosystem assessment report. It's not a very positive message. So what we put in was, well, basically the message is, if you are in a linear, fossil and extractive business, then there is no future. So you better become nature positive. That's the only future we should want to anticipate, or that we can imagine as sustainable. That led to a whole debate also with economists from the UN, from the UNEP itself, from the World Bank, OECD. But in the end, they sort of accepted the narrative. And I think that that's already symbolic, that even in the heart of the institutions that are supposed to ensure long-term, there is this short-term reflex. But at the same time, that this current momentum that is going on is opening that up. And I think the short-term view might be that we are not recovering in the right way, but the view of transition is that underneath there's an explosion of individuals and professionals that are now looking for alternatives, but maybe don't know where to look or think. So if we bring that to the finance system, and this is also the mission Dirk and I now have, is to try and bring the people in the finance system out of their current debate of financing and transition to how can we create a better finance system. Dirk, maybe you can explain it.
Yeah, so you're all familiar with what our current system is, GDP based. That is material welfare. The more goods we produce, the more services, the happier we are, in theory. And underlying is the financial system, which looks in a risk-adjusted way to financing projects. So that's what we do today. And the first one is the transition which Dirk alluded to. That's the economic transitions in mobility, in food production, renewable energy. And that's basically, you all know the work of Stiglitz, broad welfare beyond GDP, where you have material, immaterial welfare, and the third, the natural capital, the environment. So that's happening. And now it becomes interesting. What is the reaction of the financial sector? And that is really, okay, guys, we see these risks. Okay, they slowly become aware. Huh? So until yesterday, it was climate. And then yesterday, Frank Elderson, that's our champion in the Netherlands, put biodiversity on the agenda. So now they understand that biodiversity with pollination and other things are also useful. So now they see that risk as well. And they are a bit behind the cycle, but each time they say, okay, now water scarcity, they understand. But then what is the impact on my returns, on my financial value from these risks? So from a risk perspective, they want to preserve the financial value of their lending or of their investment. And there was one question, I think it was from Anupam. Yes, banks are including it now in credit risk analysis. They're including it in investment risk, but from a risk perspective. So how to reduce the prospect of losses. But what we, and that's useful, of course, but what we really want to see, and we are hoping for, is that the sector, like the economy, is transitioning and say, okay, I want to reduce negative impact, that's risk reduction, but I also want to generate positive impact. The picture of the nature positive economy. Dirk is an optimist, that's why he's still in business. That he drew this picture on this report, which has a very dark warning message, but a positive picture because it is all possible if only we want to do it. That's the only question. If only we want to do it, we can tomorrow start doing it. For example, you probably know Triodos Bank in the Netherlands, Etica Bank in Italy, GLS in Germany, these ethical banks. They just only finance positive impact projects. Otherwise, they don't do it. And then risk and return is the second important thing. The first one is my lending generating positive? Otherwise, I don't do it. And then in the textbook, we have developed Principles of Sustainable Finance. We introduced this concept of integrated value, where you say, yes, we need a financial return to survive, but we need positive social return, and we need positive return on natural capital. We cannot go on with polluting. So all three has to be positive to be a positive investment decision. And the key thing is, and we had a webinar, Dirk, Willem and I, in July, and then we did a post-mortem of the webinar, not of ourselves. And where was the thinking going wrong? And then our colleague Willem, he's a very quiet guy, so he was drawing this graph while we were speaking. And finance people are like normal people. They're well-meaning, so they see the need to reduce emissions. So the long-term vision, they're not stupid. And then Dirk showed on one of the previous slides this idea, these ESG funds. If you believe the marketing, half of investment is now in ESG, environmental, social, governance funds. So finance is making its contribution. Majority of these ESG funds is just negative screening, that you take tobacco and coal out of your portfolio, and then you are already called an ESG fund. But there's a lot of labeling, ratings, regulation. We have even the green taxonomy of the Commission. I think you put things in stone and you reduce dynamics. So the Commission doesn't like me anymore because I'm negative about the taxonomy. So they think if we do these things, then we get there. What's underlying, that's why I think public or private finance is not the difference, but the goal is the difference. Is your goal really to be nature positive? And of course, also finance positive. You need to make return to survive. I'm at a business school. Or is your goal still generating financial value? So if you're a pension fund, yes, I want to do sustainable investing, but it should not be at the expense of the financial return, because I have a fiduciary duty to my beneficiaries, and they forget that their duty is not only the money, but also the nice environment and the nice communities where these pensioners want to live in. If you redefine this future as having a pension in a livable world, you automatically come to integrated value where you say, okay, yes, I need return, but I want positive communities and I want to have a positive environment. And it is really this goal function where this mindset, that's why cultures is so important, which is for 90% in the financial sector still financial value based. We came to the conclusion after a webinar that yes, lots of people are willing, but don't dare to change the paradigm. The paradigm is, do I want to produce money as bank or do I want to produce positive impact? And then this is a summary of this old and new paradigm. And in economics, you recognize it straight away, this audience, from GDP growth to broad welfare, profit maximization to purpose-driven, Colin Mayer, Alex Edmonds. And you make your decision-making now also on social and environmental indicators. That's the key thing. You still keep your economic thinking, but you add these other factors. And you go beyond the shareholders, go to stakeholders. New Zealand has this well-being budget. And in the Netherlands, we are meant to go to a well-being budget as well in the future. So that when you have discussion on the annual budget, you really see what the spending is for getting your environmental target.
I think there are a couple of good questions in the chat, but we have 5 minutes or so. Then I look at Gillian, she's nodding. Okay, that's because what does it mean? Because what Dirk is describing is a part of the transition mindset, but it's also an indicator that a transition is happening. So politicians are thinking about expanding from GDP. There's all sorts of ethical discussions in the finance system itself. Yes, we can share some of the ratings or the accounting or the measurement or the impact measurement kind of methods that are emerging. And to some extent, there's still optimization, but they are indicative of an underlying shift. And at the same time, we also see, and Bert pointed at some of these alternatives emerging, the cryptocurrencies, the bitcoins, but there's also the alternative currencies. There's sort of the mobile app. So the whole digitalization in Africa, especially where you don't need a bank anymore, but you can create your own economy or do your own finance system. So the transition logic is to start to zoom out and see the bigger patterns. So the pattern of lock-in, sort of the desired long-term direction, and then in terms of backcasting, where are these emerging? There's all sorts of methods that we can talk about, but maybe just to summarize. So what we see is that from a transition management or governance perspective, what we need to focus on is not so much to repeat all the problems in the existing regime, but maybe focus on the emerging patterns that are potentially leading to this positive transition. So it's about changes within the existing system. It's about the emerging alternative discourse and how can we nurture and grow that. But it's also about phase out. It's about being much more radical or outspoken or maybe even strategic about what we don't want anymore. So we call it the governance mix, but that's, and here are some pictures. This is what Willem Schramade made. So we can map all sorts of elements on here. The bigger story is we need to think about it in a much more strategic way about also the transition dynamics that are emerging in the finance regime and how we can maybe help move them in a more desired direction. So we have the longer term narrative. Now it's about engaging people and institutions within the regime as well as outside of the regime that are engaged with promising alternatives to make this transition happen.
Shall I take this one,
Yep.
Dirk?
Go ahead.
Because
Gwendolyn also asked a question about it.
exactly, and so that's why we made this picture slide. And thank you, Gwendolyn, for this question. So I'm battling now with the ECB. Christine Lagarde started, and attribute also in this audience to the other half of population. She really has leadership, and she's really smart. When she went to the European Parliament for one of the hearings, she wanted to meet the economists who wrote her a letter that monetary policy should become green, so she could use that in Parliament. And she really wants to change. And now I can tell you what's happening, because some of you think, okay, if we make the money system public, then we can solve all the problems. But if the public bodies still have this neoliberal thinking, like the IMF till recently and the ECB till today, and the ECB call it market neutrality. So if we buy corporate bonds, we have to do it proportionally how they are on the market. As it happens, capital intensive company with lots of corporate bonds are carbon intensive, like Shell and steel companies, because consultants or lawyers, they don't need money. If you buy just corporate bonds on the market, you basically have a 50% over bias to brown economy. And it really takes a lot of pain to get to the central bankers the idea that there is a bias, because they say we do our monetary policy in a market neutral way. That is their gospel. So that's the neoliberal thinking in central banks, in the public sector. So public sector people can also be caught by neoliberal thinking. So Lagarde promised to change. The majority of the ECB board is now on the good side, but she faces 19 governors where the majority is still in the old thinking. And she is going to do it by June. So she has to get the paradigm shift of these 19 men from market neutrality to the recognition that there is a carbon bias and we should do monetary policy different. And with quantitative easing, we should buy a little bit less oil corporate bonds and more of low carbon companies. And so to me, it is not private versus public finance. It is really, what are the decision makers doing? Are they old-fashioned economist trained, only growth or return driven? Or do they have the mindset of being mindful about positive impact? And a question to you, do you know who's the biggest investor in private equity and hedge funds? So please unmute, and who's the biggest investor in private equity and hedge funds? Do you know that?
Pension funds?
Pension funds, exactly. And why? Because they have a higher return. And we all know that quite the majority, not all of them, but the majority of private equity and hedge funds, they don't care. Some hedge funds are even using a CSR rating of a company to hit them, because that means wasteful spending and they can strip the company. So that's the mindset of these people. And why do pension funds invest in them? Because they want to have a higher return. So our nice pension funds who tell us that they are sustainable are the ones who are financing private equity and hedge funds. So that's the current financial system. And my argument up for debate, and I'm happy to hear your views, is that this mindset, whether you are at the ECB, at the IMF, or at the pension fund or at the private equity fund, that's the key issue, how to change that into Derek's transition curve, rather than whether we have public or private money creation. It is the paradigm behind the financial system which needs change. What would be my statement for discussion?
I think, yeah, we are also at the end of the presentation of what we want to share, but there's more interesting questions to pick up. I'm looking at Gillian as a, or maybe Bert. What do you propose as a next step?
Right. So I propose the following. I'm going to give the floor if Bert would like to say a couple of words now. Then we're going to go to breakouts just to let everybody talk. I only made 3 breakouts. So just so that everybody can talk at the same time, 15 minutes. Then we come back and we've got about 35 minutes where we can pick up those questions and let people discuss with you, if that's okay. Would that be okay with both of you?
Sure. Good.
Okay, great. So Bert, I don't know if you want to make a couple of comments here before I put people into smaller groups for chat.
Yes, one comment is, can I again share the screen?
Yeah.
Because of course I now have to find, yes, this was my presentation last sheet, but I had one more, and that was on leverage points. And I just wanted to point out, if you can see this, that what I liked about the report by Dirk and Dirk is that they fit nicely in the thinking in terms of leverage points. Because what we see in terms of the leverage points is that now the system, and I have heard this in many discussions, is really trying to change minor things, and then there are many good intentions and certain parameters are changed, certain percentages are changed, etc. But you know that it's actually not in any sense structural. So you realize then that to change something, you have to look for example, a system dynamics approach in which you understand better the delays, the feedbacks, etc. Even better, of course, is that you look at it in terms of the structure, which was already also part of the first sheet by Dirk. And I think what really matters, and what is also mentioned several times in your talk, is that in the end, what really has to change is the goal of the system. And that implies that basic mindsets and paradigms are really the thing which has to be addressed. And given this background, I found also that your approach certainly is interesting for us and is in itself fairly exceptional at the moment to look at this larger picture. It's something which my colleague Klaas often mentions. Everyone is zooming in, partly to optimize his or her own situation, and nobody's zooming out. And this is an attempt at zooming out on an important topic. So
it's also no coincidence, Bert, because Donella was a big inspiration, but also the leverage points itself were very foundational also for the whole transition governance thinking.
Right.
That's also why we decided to start now with a bit of a more personal story, because it's the writing of this report in itself was also trying to change the paradigm or take a step in changing the paradigm from sort of more the financing the transitions to finance in transitions. Yeah.
Yes, I see. And this is also part of my own work, that I try to discuss sustainability items in terms of worldviews and worldview pluralism. So having said this, I also looked up the various chats, and there are a number of issues, of course, we can discuss. A personal question I have is related to a previous question which Gwen had. In the EU, but also in the US, we see now this massive amount of money being created for Corona. Only 10 years ago, we all had to go in the direction of austerity, especially in Europe. And all of a sudden, because of public health perceptions, we create now millions of money. But if I say create, what actually is happening now with the money flows? Where are these 60 billions coming from? Is it just pension funds and also wealthy individuals who are now giving European citizens this money for a time, asking interest for it and expecting it to be paid back in the future? is that really what's happening? And if so, isn't then it's ridiculous that we cannot simply create this money in view of the fact that the risk of inflation is generally considered low? Just read the recent book, The Deficit Myth. Maybe something are wrong in that book, but nevertheless, there are many arguments among a whole school of economists that that would be quite possible. So this is one issue and I think Gwen also had in mind to discuss with you.
Can you say something about it, Dirk? Then I can
Yeah, I think,
pick up Anita's point.
yeah.
Well, we're going to have a Q&A afterwards.
Okay.
Okay.
So
We'll
I don't
fix
know
it
if it's
up later.
okay. I
Yeah.
wanted to just let everybody talk for a moment. So we're going to go
Yeah.
into breakout groups. And since we're a small group, maybe I'll do like 10 minutes in the breakouts. And then when we come back, we can really kind of all discuss together. Is that okay?
Yeah.
So I've actually created 2 breakout groups, and I've left a few people here in the plenary because I think that I couldn't move Melita. So a few of you won't go anywhere and the other people will go. So let me just open the rooms, 10 minutes. So you should get, some of you have gotten an invitation and you should pop out to a breakout. Okay, Anupam, did you get an invitation? Okay. All right, so people are in their breakouts now. We're staying here just because Melita, when I tried to do it automatically, I couldn't move you, so I didn't want you to be left out. So if you can.
Thank you.
That's okay, as long as you can hear. So we're just in the plenary for a breakout, and it's just a chance to, hey there.
Hi.
Hi. Just to take some initial thoughts from anybody, I put Dirk, and Bert in separate rooms, but we don't have to use this necessarily as a Q&A. Dirk, you probably also want to know what people think.
Yeah, no, I'm in a listening mode now.
Yeah. Great. So anybody can start. What are your thoughts?
So does it mean people are in different breakouts already? So we can just,
Yes.
First
Yep.
time, it's amazing.
Okay.
So in a very, well, the line may go off quite quickly. So it's, I just have to find a better, I'm really fascinated by the fact that paradigm and mindsets are at the core of this. And having come to Mozambique, it's the first time I'm in a 4-year project. I've done a lot of consulting on a short, let's say on a short time horizon in Nigeria and in Zambia. And then I was offered this opportunity basically for a 4-year project, which allows me to really understand the development paradigm and move things in the renewable energy sector, which is my work. But I've joined this webinar because I've been always curious on how we can combine a lot of the work that we've been doing with energy literacy with financial literacy. So especially in developing countries, but everywhere, there's a problem in just understanding just the know-how of how financial systems work. So yes, we can take advantage of the financial systems once we know how they work, but if they don't, and let's say if we're focusing on developing countries, I'm really curious, how is it handled and how I would like to proceed with whatever advice to take it further, because I'm working on actually 2 projects which are on rural electrification. And I see that there's a lot of donor funding that goes into bringing energy, especially renewable energy, but not enough even donor funding or any sufficient attention goes into joining the efforts of financial literacy together with energy literacy. And so I'm very glad that you are pushing this in the mindset paradigm direction. And yeah, I would be so glad to just follow in this to understand better. And,
Great. All right, thank you. Then maybe I'll let Dennis and Helga jump in, and then Dirk, if you want to say something, we can also bring Melita's good question back when everybody's together.
Yeah.
So Dennis, why don't you go next, and then Helga.
I'd like to share my screen. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. So let me say, I appreciated this presentation. Of course, I generally agree with all the ideas, but there was one I disagree with, or at least I have a different point of view. The presentation was made under the assumption that somehow the old system will go away and the new system will rise up, and then your emphasis is on how do you create the institutions of the old system over into the institutions of the new system. But in fact, historically, it doesn't work like that. Historically, the old system collapses, and then for quite a long time, there is a period of no system, chaos. And then slowly some new system emerges. I mean, and this takes a long time. When the Romans disappeared, it was almost 1,000 years between the decline of the Roman Empire and the reemergence of medieval Europe. And this is for two reasons. First of all, during this period, the bad institutions can outcompete the good institutions. The people who externalize costs and don't bear them, obviously, are going to beat out the people who internalize costs and therefore have higher priced short-term products. Secondly, the powers who are benefiting from the old system viciously resist the innovations that are required. And during this period, they have the prevailing power. So we really need to go through this period where they lose their resources, they lose their social capital, they lose their influence positions before something new can emerge. And if you think the system we're facing is this one instead of this one, it gives you a totally different perspective on what we need to do about the financial system. Here you're trying to convert institutions. Here you're trying to husband resources. Here you're working at the global scale. Here you're basically trying to sustain the capacity of small communities to innovate, etc. So if you accept this, then it's interesting. How do we reinterpret finances? I think you come up with a different set of priorities. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dennis. And Helga, what about you? Some thoughts?
Yeah, Dennis. I'm aware of both approaches, and I sort of move between optimism on the one hand and rather pessimistic view on the other hand. And we have the same issue in deep adaptation thinking. And one of the more positive things is that many of the things you need to do for Dennis' transition are pretty much the same things you need to do for the more optimistic transition. At least some of the things, maybe the most basic things. My question was rather pertained to I mean, I'm not a financial person. I'm a natural scientist. I'm a climatologist. And I have been responsible for a summer school on alternative economic and monetary systems that we offer every summer. And I just tried to bring in the natural boundaries into these discussions. What I find so very difficult is to understand within these financial systems, what are really basic changes and what is just different instruments. I mean, what you said in this lecture, and I thank you very much for that lecture, is that it's the mindset. Is it financial gain or is some other aim? That's rather clear. But of all the things that are being offered now, there's a wealth of alternative things being offered, and I find it very difficult to put them into some sort of categorization or whatever. It's not clear to me what is just a minor tool that can be applied in different systems and what is a real systemic change that really could take us forward.
That's a great question, Helga, and that answers Dennis' point. A colleague of ours, Rutger Hoekstra, wrote a book, Beyond GDP. His argument is, why is GDP so powerful? Because it's like a multinational. Everybody's using the same word. Accounts are based on it. There is a language. So it is really the incumbent issue. So GDP is harmonized across countries by the UN, and Stiglitz, there are almost more than 100 broad welfare definitions. And what Rutger Hoekstra is saying, we should stop making new measures. You have the happiness index of Richard Layard, and you have millions of them. And Amartya Sen has one, and everybody has a baby. We don't need more babies, but we need a community. Like we have a community for GDP, we need a community for beyond GDP. And this community needs to get harmonized. And once they've harmonized and clear definitions, they help you, Helga, because then at your summer school you can offer clear concepts, just one, as an alternative to GDP. And so the question is, and I really, Dennis, I think it is an open question, can we get there without first the French Revolution, that you used the guillotine to kill the old system before we can start a new system? Or can we shift with new definitions, new paradigms? That's an open question. But the key issue is not more concepts, but consolidation of the new thinking into the same powerful single paradigm as an alternative. And then if we have enough power to move over, and let me give an example in the Netherlands. I don't know whether you know Triodos Bank. It's a small bank, but growing very fast. Etica and GLS in Germany are the same. And the head of this bank, he's there for more than 20 years. He asked himself the question, should I become part of the board of the Bankers Association? Every country has some Bankers Associations where the powerful guys are. Or should I stay out and keep my hands clean? And he made the decision, let's go inside the system, because then I can try to reform the system from within. To some extent, we had the climate discussion in the Netherlands, and the financial system has signed up also to want to realize 50% reduction. So, and whether we will succeed, I don't know, Dennis. So you're right. Whether there are only good intentions, as Beth said, or whether we really get change from the financial system, I cannot say. But at least this Triodos Bank said, I'm no longer staying in the niche. I'm going to play game with the big guys, aiming for change. And yes, you're right. Do we need to get rid of the old incumbents before we can start anew? And we have seen it with Macron in France. He got the minister for environment, which he wanted to have, and he left because Macron was not true to his word and was sticking with industry. And the Green minister left because he said Macron is not keeping up. So there are forces on the incumbents and there are forces on the new ones. Do we first need to kill the old system? Yeah, I think it is an open question, but like Dirk, I'm positive, and that's why it is extremely important that we really have to check the paradigm and the mindset to check whether it is really truthful. And in small detail, when the EU is now doing the green taxonomy, one of the workouts is advised by BlackRock, who's really, to be honest, on the old side. And people like me are not taking part in that consultation because the wrong people are doing it. So the forces are still very difficult to handle. I don't know whether Melita is still in.
Melita's in. Everybody's going to be coming back in 17 seconds, but if you want to talk a little bit about the financial and energy literacy and what can be done in developing countries, that was kind of her issue. Yeah. And then people will join us and you can keep talking.
Yeah. Okay, I can answer that because Melita, we did our students did a case for Rabobank, and they have some free money to spend in Africa, and the students had to make an investment proposal. And what they came up with, so how to reduce food waste, and most food is wasted from production towards consumption, because like in Africa, a lot is just disappears because if you cannot cool your harvest, it just disappears. So the students came up with solar panels where you can have local cooling boxes. And in that way, you can keep up, you can preserve the food, and you would have a huge increase. And then Rabobank would finance these solar panel units with cooling systems. So that's one really an example where energy and finance can come together. And yes, Africa is quite clear where with solar panels you can do a lot. Like you went from no telephone to mobile telephone in Africa and Southeast Asia. You can go from no energy to solar energy in Africa. And the financial system should facilitate that. And literacy, financial literacy is extremely important, because if with microfinance, and again, it are the women who are getting the money, they can build a small business, making some savings, and then getting out of poverty, and in that way empower themselves. And the interesting thing is that like Amundi and other, they use money from the IFC, the private arm of the World Bank. That's guaranteeing it. And then Amundi is putting a lot of money to local banks in Africa, because the African banks can make the decisions on the ground. They know the people where to lend to and not. And like Mozambique, where access to credit is a really big hurdle, this kind of initiatives like IFC guaranteed money, together with private money from Amundi and other asset managers, into African local players to really help the African economy to build up. So, and then you need literacy on the ground to use the money wisely. So financial literacy, I think, like in South Africa, the central bank, that is the #1 policy goal for the Reserve Bank of South Africa, is improving financial literacy. And I fully agree with that, because if we can people empower to use the money for entrepreneurship, they can really help them and help their families.
But Dirk, I was in a breakout with Gwendolyn, and she grilled me about money actually being debt and always produced by private banks. So if financial literacy, if that's still part of this dominant money logic where money always represents debt, and is therefore also in essence an extractive thing. I'm trying to paraphrase you, Gwendolyn. I don't know if you're doing it correctly, but I thought maybe Dirk has a better answer.
Well, it starts with my disagreement with your premise that it doesn't matter where the money comes from, the public or the private sector, because in fact, the way our current system works, even though we look at the central banks, like you have on your list, as public money, here in the US, when the government creates money, it borrows it from the private banks. So all of our public money here is also borrowed from the private banks. And today some news came out that now the amount we owe those banks on that debt for the US dollar being out there is more than most of our domestic budgets. It's like 52 trillion or something like that, or billion, but it's astronomically more than we're spending on any of the programs that actually lift people out of poverty. I just put a comment in about how a universal basic income as a strategy, which could be a money creation strategy by central banks, if they were actually issuing public money instead of borrowing it from the private sector, would be a whole lot better way to lift people out of poverty than to put them into debt.
Yeah, I think let's put the basic income story separate, because that's a story in itself, whether it's a good idea or not. In Europe, the ECB is creating money. The QE program is really, by refinancing banks, it creates really the ECB, which is part of government in the end. So the QE in Europe is used for money creation, which in the end flows into the economy. And my issue is, and yes, that in the end it is financing banks, and banks are financing other parts of the system. And then the mindset of the people who are handing out the money, lending and investing, really matters. So the ECB is doing the QE. They expand their balance sheet, they are creating money. But then the question is how the money is used. And basic income, I really find a different story. That's is basic income a good idea or not? That's we can have a long discussion on it, and then we have a discussion about incentives and so on. But yeah, but I know I'm in the Sustainable Finance Lab with Bet, and there the majority view is that money creation matters. If we get a handle on money creation, then we have solved the problem. I'm not sure of that.
Let me, Dennis, you wanted to jump into this. You had your hand up. Do you want to go next, and you can go back to some questions?
I had a question. Privately, I mentioned the problem of transition because the bad actors have more power than the good actors, and they resist change. So I've always looked for ways that you can start small areas of change. And in this case, local currency seemed interesting to me. How does the phenomenon of local currencies enter into your thinking about this?
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we've been also involved in quite a few projects, also looking at the global spread of alternative currencies. In our jargon, we call them niches. So they are alternatives to the norm. And what we saw, and especially in the UK, a lot of interesting work is being done, that especially after the economic crash, there was a huge acceleration in the growth and in the number of these kinds of initiatives. And the interesting thing is the last decade, this has happened. So in one of our projects, Transit, we met over 1 million people that are globally actively trading in these alternative local currencies, but they're all very small. And at the same time, there's these digital currencies, and to us, they are the seeds of transformative change. So the transformative innovations that are associated with a different type of thinking and a different type of economic practices that are much more locally connected and are also connected to a local economy much more. If you look at economic research, then you see in times of crises, these local, more resilient economic models, they always grow. So in times of crisis, people flee to or look for more of these alternatives. And in part, what you would hope is that governments now not only top-down pour more debt-based money into the big economy and the bad actors, as you say it, but find ways to support the growth of local economies. But there also is this power issue that these local economies are often outside government control or taxation or regulation. So what they do is they defy also the regime. And I think we haven't figured out ways to support it in a more structural way. But maybe Dirk has an opinion.
But let's discuss that. Let's combine it, alternative and digital currency. There is a great one called Bitcoin. And to reinforce my earlier point, we all know how Bitcoin is used. The people who use it do it for profit maximization. And I don't have to tell you about the fluctuations in value, and probably none of you touch Bitcoins. So alternative currency can be used for the good and for the bad. So being alternative is, I think, not, with what purpose are you using the money? And yes, if you use it for your local settlement, then a lot of good things can come from it. We all know the stories of currencies which are used for the good. But equally, you could use an alternative digital currency for the bad reasons. So that reinforces my point that is the mindset and the paradigm of the actors rather than the currency they have in their hands.
Sorry, go ahead, Derek. I'm going to structure the conversation a little bit, but you say something first.
Yeah, because this relates to the research agenda we have in the transitions community, is that we see that there's, on the one hand, this destabilization at the regime level. So bad actors are increasingly in a position of pressure and where they have to reposition, or at least are more in the defense. And at the same time, we see an emerging set of alternative technologies and practices and discourse. And now the question really becomes, how do we create a link between the people that are now more maybe have grown up within a regime environment, but are open to transformative change, and these alternative emerging communities that are able to translate their ideas more into the mainstream? Because a lot of these alternative currencies are also they want to change the system, but never become the system. So they become a barrier to transformative change in themselves. But the people that are now in the banks and in the ministries or in private equity funds that now want to do it differently, they have never experienced that other logic. So they don't recognize it and they don't understand it yet. So they need to be sort of engaged. So this is really an interesting also psychological challenge. How do we create bridges between those two communities or parts of society that are open to transformative change, but maybe don't speak the same language yet, or don't know how to work together, or
Okay, thank you. So a number of people asked questions in the chat before. So Anita, you asked, Helga, you had a couple of questions. Anupam, you certainly did. Even Bert, you did. So you had discussions in breakouts too. So you might have already answered those questions. But if you still have them, if you could put your digital hand up, I'm going to give the floor first to Anupam. And if any of the other of you want to jump in again with your question or a revised version of that, just Zoom will give me an order of when your hands go up. So Anupam, why don't you go first and then we'll go to Anita.
Thank you. First, let me just compliment you on covering this huge territory of an extremely complex area in such a short time. Very illuminating. Thank you so much. So 5 years ago, leaders of world nations actually signed the Paris Agreement, and all of them committed to working towards keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees, rising below 1.5 degrees. However, over the last 5 years, I am not aware of any financial institution actually creating any measure in order to decide whether they would invest in projects which are going to counter these commitments in respective countries. So my first question is there any such measure? Because I can see that as the immediate practical way of looking at a transition which seems to have a global consensus. The second question I have is that, is there somebody who has been tracking the difference between investments in sustainable businesses or businesses which will result in sustainable scenarios for the world and businesses which will result in unsustainable scenarios for the world, or in terms of creating methodologies to help financial institutions to actually assess such investments? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. What I might do before you answer that is let's hear from Anita and Christina. So Dirk and Derek, if you could just make some notes, if that's okay, Anupam, and then we'll collect. We've got about 15 minutes to go. So Anita, why don't you go next?
Sure. Thanks first for this really interesting presentation. I echo the sentiment you've covered a ton of ground. So this may be kind of a specific question, but I'm just curious about this topic in countries that have limited resources. I'm thinking mostly from the public sector and government spending that do rely on donor finance to support aspects of the transition, where some of these external bodies, like for example, the Green Climate Fund or others, have these specific criteria for adaptation or mitigation, additionality or sustainability or something that may successfully shift selection pressures, but though perhaps kind of in this top-down or external way that's less endogenous to some of the changes that you had just, the way that you had described some of these changes. And this question just comes from some experience where I've seen government actors where they kind of perceive these external criteria as like trade-offs between these near-term actions that they also don't have enough money to fund and these like long-term sustainability targets. And I recognize this is possibly a product of like a problematic donor-based aid model and kind of a lot of other things going on, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are on these tensions.
Great, thank you, Anita. And then Christina, you asked the third question. We'll go back to Dirk and Derek.
Yes, thank you as well for the nice presentation. My question concerns, can you hear me? Because I just switched to
Yes.
headphones.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. My question concerns your proposition of having this integrated value-based financial system. So when you talk about that, do you have in mind something like, let's say, deep worldview shift, or how is this different from existing discussions on integrating externalized negative effects on the environment by, for instance, proposing payments for ecosystem services or other ways in which, for instance, nature, is still regarded in this monetarized form? So how would that differ, and who would be defining the indicators for this type of integrated value? Would it be various stakeholders together, or who and how would that work?
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so I don't know which one of you wants to, you've got two questions from Anupam, one from Anita on donor finance and aid, and then the question about the integrated system from Christina.
Yeah, so shall I do a kickoff?
Go ahead. Yeah.
We have in the booklet at the end, because you asked, is there a measure that we see financing the climate goals? And then it really becomes interesting because everybody is publishing that it is increasing its renewable finance. So any respectable bank announces with big press releases that it has doubled its renewable energy financing, means from 1 to 2% of its portfolio. Great. But it only makes sense if we at the same time reduce fossil fuel lending. So if you have 20% of your portfolio in fossil fuel and you have 1% in renewable and you keep your fossil fuel part of your portfolio, not much at all is happening. So, so we argue and we show you some graphs at the end of the booklet. You can only measure it where you show the increase in renewable and the decrease in fossil. So you get the total picture. And we look at the International Energy Agency numbers. Up till 2030, fossil fuel emissions will not go down. So all the news about renewable is just basically providing the energy for the data centers of Apple and Google. But basically, we keep
and Bitcoin.
And Bitcoin. Yeah, that's why I really dislike this alternative currency, Bitcoin. So we have to measure from two sides, and then we are really disappointed. And I'm pushing banks to show the full picture. Second, and that's a bit going to Christina and to you, how to measure sustainability. And if we take this picture of Dirk, positive finance, nature of positive economy. So we are really like finance. If you make a loss, you don't start a project. That's the net present value rule. If you don't have a positive impact, you don't continue for society or for environment. So you can really say, you can monetize it because the numbers, like a carbon price of 110 euros, these numbers are around. So if you don't pay a living wage, you should not buy these clothes. You can easily measure these things. Like with, you need a financial profit in the plus before you start a project, you need positive environmental and positive social flows before you start the project. That's the idea behind integrated value, which we put in our book, Principles of Sustainable Finance, and we are now filling them in, how we really can make them practicable. So it is possible. It goes beyond measuring ecosystems and monetizing them. It is far deeper. So any social and environmental issue you will take into account. And if it is negative, and there is no transition path to making it positive, like you have a 10-year or 5-year transition, then you don't do it. It is as easy as that as we do with normal projects. If there is no financial return, we don't do it, or we stop the bank loan. That's the, if you do it genuinely. And that means the mindset. It is not the method, but the mindset that you say, okay, if there is negative impact, I stop my investment or my loan. And that's why we argue to Anupam's question, everybody is investing according to the market index where there are no sustainability issues incorporated. So you really need to do fundamental analysis of a company to check what's happening. My co-author Willem Schamade is doing that. And the industry is really going for passive investing. So all this passive investing, and don't believe these ETFs who are tracking ESG funds. They are like credit ratings, they're quite bullshit. So fundamental investing is the way forward, and the amount of fundamental investing is decreasing. So the financial sector, and now I'm coming to Dennis, the financial sector is not yet on its way to do the good thing. So the incumbents are still on the wrong track, I'm afraid to say.
Yeah, I think you have much more authority to talk about the financial sector, but even you cannot determine its course. So I think what we do is we share ideas about an emerging direction. And I think I shared a couple of links also to the kind of movements that is happening, Anupam. There's quite some movement in the financial sector and in the universities, in the academic world, in the accounting sector that is actually engaging with this topic. But to have a sort of a neutral assessment whether a company is in line with the 1.5 target is a very difficult one. Because it's about the future and about uncertainties. So that's the whole point of the finance system or the finance regime. It's about reducing uncertainties, and what you don't know, you just externalize, which is why we got into the whole problem. But that's, so we now actually have a court case of a friend of mine is leading Friends of the Earth. They are suing Shell for not having their investment portfolio in line with the 1.5 degrees. It's going to be very interesting what the judge will say, because it's also, can an NGO get a private company to court and so on. So what we try to do is try to point at this emerging movement also as a way to maybe help guide and accelerate it. And to me, the integrated value idea is also and it relates to this nature positive idea. It's trying to change the conversation from reducing negatives and reducing risks and going to zero to just saying reward and invest in those things that have a positive impact. And that's something that you can identify, you can show it already, and you can, yes, you can also start to measure it. But it's a completely different conversation. So invest in, that's why I also shared this iFund. I'm a chair of this impact investor. And it's just private money looking for opportunities to invest in entrepreneurs or in activities that have a direct positive impact and contribution to a sustainability transition. So I think that's, I also see some IEA conversations. I think that's part of the points that we are touching upon, that the dominant regime, the dominant mindset in the finance system, but also in the scenario world when it comes to energy scenarios in IEA, it's projecting the present outward to the future, and everything that's structurally uncertain is excluded because it's uncertain. So what you then get is more of the present. And what the IEA does is that they're not a fossil lobbyist. They are just lacking imagination and insight into systems change and non-linearity. But what that does is that it has the effect of a fossil lobby, because they strengthen the existing narrative over and over again. And then I want to say something about Anita's point. So I think you referred to the climate funds and the Jeffs kind of the sort of the green banks and the green bonds. I think a lot of the donor relations are very much problematic, because they are also part of this older logic that you need an external fund to finance a transition. And to some extent, yes, it's true. We all need external funds to invest in something, but it comes with so many ties that they are often very negative. And I'm involved in this higher education. It's sort of a private university in Suriname, which is always about sustainability. And then what you see, and this is typically a developing economy or a struggling economy, whatever you want to call it, and they are relying on external funds. At the same time, they have a very small elite, which makes a lot of money by extracting a lot of resources and selling it off into the private sphere. And then in terms of the potential that they have to create sustainable alternatives when it comes to energy or food, it's massive. But the donor funds are not financing independence. In a way, they want to finance projects with a revenue that come them with a lot of conditions that make it harder for the people locally to make it worthwhile. And it's like we're now in the Netherlands buying out, saving our national airliner, KLM, because they're struggling because of Corona. So we give them a couple of billion euros to survive, but they have to pay it back. And it comes with all sorts of additional conditions to make it more sustainable, the airliner more sustainable. So what we do, actually, it has the effect of adding to this lock-in situation. So it's very complex, but I don't think it's the way to think about it. I see more in developing a more locally connected and rooted economy. And there are also ways or people that are experimenting with ways to support that with not only finance, but also capacity or expertise.
So we've got about 6 or so minutes left, and I want to give Bert the last word. So Bert, you have the last 4 or 5 minutes, but would anyone like to make any further comments? There's been a lot of interesting things going on in the chat, Dirk, as you referred to. Thank you, Louis, for putting in a link to the debate about IEA. Christina asked about the Islamic banking principles and whether those have kind of gone to the wayside or whether they're still very much a part of the narrative. I don't know whether anybody wants to quickly touch on that. No.
Sorry.
I think the whole debt-free lending, I think that's a very interesting concept, and we should definitely have it. More I can say about it.
Okay. All
Okay.
right.
So,
Bert, go ahead.
So
Wrap
I'm
us up.
going to make some concluding remarks. Well, apart from enjoying the Balaton flavor, I think we, of course, were not able to solve the really important topics of this complex affair. But I made a few points for myself. I noticed, by the way, that the green banks were not mentioned, and we have in the Netherlands 2 relatively small green banks. And I am convinced enough that it helps that at least whatever money I have is already for a long time with our green banks. And they do publish criteria where they invest and why they invest. But I think I made 3 brief conclusions. The first one is that the whole discussion on public versus private money and money creation by governments is a sensitive topic, and there are still no clear views here and clear arguments here how things are, as far as I can see. We had a discussion in Sustainable Finance Lab. There are controversies, there are uncertainties, there are differences in opinion. And I finally conclude for myself that the key point there is that there is a lot of distrust in the honesty, integrity, capabilities of our governments, which means that it's related actually to the very ideal and practice of democracy. And we have to think in this direction if we have to follow up on this topic, I think. My second remark is that I still feel also from this discussion that we addressed a very important point in this whole discussion, which is that it's really about mindsets. We somehow have to go to the higher level of the leverage points, so to say, and see if we can address, especially within the community of economists, I would say, these more imperative goals, mindsets, etc. And I hope that if we do this, slowly, it will penetrate into the behavior and the actions of, let's say, the corporate world and also the large government agencies. But, and that's my third point, I think personally that for whatever beautiful upward curve Dirk showed us, we need something which I would call social activism. Because if we are not able to mobilize fairly large groups of people by telling them what is at stake, and by telling them that if they unite somehow at the local or regional level in cooperatives, then these things will not happen. They will be, let's say, conquered by the Amazons of this world and by all the other big affairs. So I mentioned the example of water. In water, there is now a massive global movement towards remunicipalization. That means taking back control after privatization. And it happens by citizens who become aware of what is at stake and how they actually are being exploited since privatization. And I think this kind of social activism has to be part of this upward curve. And in that sense, I think Dirk's remark was important. We have somehow not simply dismiss those, let's say, NGOs and civil action initiatives. We have to see how we can bridge those movements, those ambitions, those practices at a local level, including local currencies, with the mainstream of people where at least a minority hopefully is open for such bridging effort. So that's basically what I took from it. And well, it helped me to make a small step again in understanding this. So I thank you all for this and for organizing it, and of course for presenting it, especially Dirk and Dirk.
Great, perfect, thank you. Feel free to unmute and applaud if you want, since we're nice to hear your background. Well, the timing couldn't be more perfect. It's like 1 minute in advance, and that was a really great way, Bert. Thank you for wrapping that up, and thank you for thanking our 2 speakers. So it was terrific to have you both with us and to see you again, Dirk. And just, I think that the numbers, not only did Google go down, but apparently Zoom also went down for some. We had started our meeting early, And we got half our people in, and then apparently I've had a couple people message me that their Zoom conferences, people have been blocked out. So it's possible some people who wanted to come could not come because of this problem with Zoom and Google right now. Anyways,
if we end this Zoom meeting, we will never get in again. So we have to stay here eternally.
Exactly.
Permanent lockdown.
Exactly.
This is
So
about
anyways,
billions too.
we have a recording, which is really terrific. So I'll stop the recording now.